gamers, this is Preview Sage 04 and I am bringing you my new Zelda timeline. I'm going to cover all the canon games for the console, as well as the ones for the handheld games, from Ocarina of Time and Link's Awakening all the way to Spirit Tracks and Twilight Princess. Now, before we begin this little timeline, I want to let you guys know I'm a linearist. So if any splitists out there who disagree with my theory, well, screw you people. No, well, you may not agree if you're splitist there. Yeah. Okay, enough of my rambling. Let's start this thing. Now, before we start this, I also want to let you know that what the ideas I got for this timeline are theories from Zelda Wiki, from friends, from my own opinion, from the games themselves. Now, I'm getting these theories and I'm trying my best to back them up with evidence. So, like I said, they're only theories. Whether or not you choose to believe them is your decision. Now, let's begin with the first game, shall we? Now, the first game I want to talk about in this timeline is Skyward Sword. Now, I understand that it's a relatively new game, so there's probably not going to be a lot of information on it or depth in the plot line, but there is a basic plot line set out, so I'm just going to add that now and we can work on everything else later. Pretty much the plot line is Link lives in the land of Skyloft, which is located above what used to be Hyrule, I guess, invaded by monsters. And for some retarded reason, he falls through the clouds after, years of living there. And magically ends up in Hyrule, which is infested with monsters. Now, from there, it's known that he forges the Master Sword, drives the monsters out, and I'm going to guess recovers the 3 parts of the Triforce. If you remember in The Legend of Zelda, the very original one from the NES, there was a story about how the king, the first king of Hyrule, unified the 3 parts of the Triforce and created Hyrule by driving out the evil. Let me just leave you with that. Keep it in mind. Now, another reason why I say Skyward Sword goes first is because, well, the creators say that. Plus, it would make perfect sense in the timeline. I mean, you'd have to be an idiot not to realize this. Now, the next game in the timeline I want to add is Minish Cap. Now, a lot of people say Minish Cap doesn't go first, blah, blah, blah. People who say that are retarded. Minish Cap fits first for a few reasons. Well, obviously, there's no mention of the Master Sword, meaning it's been sealed away, and it hasn't been needed to seal away Ganon or any other kind of evil like that. What they have is the Force Sword instead. And the Triforce doesn't play as big a part. Link doesn't have the Triforce of Courage, and Ganondorf obviously doesn't have the Triforce of Power because he's not even around. So Minish Cap would have to go next. Also, another thing I'd like to point out, which another timeline, Lansoon, my mistake, pointed out before, is that Mount Cranal, which is the equivalent to Death Mountain, may in fact be Death Mountain before it was renamed. Because in the Four Swords Adventures and the Four Swords, there is a Death Mountain. But before that, it was called Mount Cranal, leading me to believe that it was renamed somewhere along the timeline. Also, what I think is that the Pickery, the tiny little midget things that live in the forest, may in fact evolve into Kokiri later on. Trust me, in this timeline, the Kokiri do a lot of evolving, so bear with me here. Now, the next game, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords. Now, whether this game comes directly after Minish Cap, or a couple hundred years later, maybe a couple generations later, I'm not sure. Now, I think a couple generations later because of the renaming of Death Mountain, but I think maybe a little later is because Link and Zelda seem to know each other pretty well, unless it was because their ancestors from Minish Cap were friends, and from there it led to a very long line of friendships. In the case of the latter, or the first option, either way it doesn't affect the timeline. But it does involve the resurrection of Vati, who seems to know Link from the past, or at least know Link from, well, the past, I guess, no pun intended. But he seems to know Link, or remember Link, someone who looked like him. And it's renamed Death Mountain, not Mount Cranal, but again, there's no Master Sword and no Ganon yet. But because of the return of Vati and the Four Sword and a lot of similarities it would have to go right after. I mean, you'd have to be a complete idiot to disagree with this. Now, you would have to be a complete dumbass to not realize what comes next, okay? If you say anything else comes next, other than the Four Swords Adventures, you got problems. I mean, it's kind of obvious. It has the same title as the previous game, with adventures added on. The game is pretty much the same. It involves the Four Sword and the revival of Vati, but this time it also involves the revival of Ganon. Now, by this point, people must be saying, this guy's an idiot for putting Ocarina of Time after all this. Not really. If you remember in Ocarina of Time, there was a war previous to the storyline when Link was a child, where the Gerudo and the Hylians hated each other. Now, at this point in the timeline, in Four Swords Adventures, the Gerudo seem to hate Ganondorf. They don't follow his beliefs like they did in Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, the Gerudo worshipped him as a king, whereas in this game, they saw him as they banished him. They didn't like him at all. He was a loner. Why I think this is because at the time, the Hylians had no reason to like Ganondorf or hate Hyrule. The Hylians had done nothing. But I think over time they were oppressed and left out of the map, maybe ignored more often than none, and they started to see Ganon's point of view and start to want to take over the world. Meaning, you know, they start bringing up traditions of worshipping the male that run the tribe and worshipping Ganondorf and everything. And that's may have what led to the war. Now, another reason why I say this comes before Ocarina of Time is because, again, there is no mention of the Master Sword. When Shigeru Miyamoto said that Ocarina of Time was the first game in the series, I think he contradicted himself for a little. Or maybe misworded things so he could throw us off track. I don't think necessarily it was the first game in the series that involved, the Legend of Zelda series. I think it was the first game in the series where Link actually pulled the Master Sword, with the exceptions of a couple games maybe. Or at least when the Master Sword was in a very common place. I'll get to this later, but you'll understand why. It pretty much marks a new era almost, an era of where the gods are sacred to the Hylians, kind of, in a more where they start to honor them more, you know. Anyway, you get what I'm saying. Enough rambling about this game. On to the next one. The next game in the series is The Legend of Zelda for NES. Now, this game features the return of Ganondorf from Four Swords Adventures, and it also features for the first time the Triforce of Power. We've already seen Wisdom from Minish Cap, where Vati went after Zelda for it. If you haven't played the game, I'm not explaining it to you. Anyway, in this game, Link must travel around Hyrule, which has been abandoned after Ganondorf took it over with monsters. He goes around, gets the 8 shards of the Triforce of Wisdom, and defeats Ganon, kicking his ass once and for all. Now, this game, I think, doesn't have the Master Sword, though it has a level 2 sword, which may be similar to it. Although, you know, you can't tell because it's given to you by some pedophilic old guy who makes Kapora Gabora look child safe. Now, see, in this game, Ganondorf talks to you like he almost knows you. He knows you're either the Link from Four Swords Adventures or a reincarnate of that Link. I'm going to go with reincarnate just to be on the safe side here. But, he's already known Link, he's already fought him, Link's already defeated him. Therefore, Ganondorf has returned in his beast form to conquer Hyrule once more and gets his ass whooped as usual. Like the point of any Zelda game, slaughter the pig and get the shiny triangle cheese. Now for the next game.